The stagecoach lurches to a violent stop in front of Holloway's general store, sending up a billowing cloud of Montana dust that hangs in the late afternoon air like a portent of the chaos about to unfold. And when the weathered door swings open with a protesting creak that seems to echo across the entire main street of Redemption Falls, every single jaw in the small frontier town drops simultaneously as though pulled by invisible strings, because the mail-order bride stepping down onto the dusty, sun-baked street isn't just beautiful with her honey-colored hair catching the golden light and her refined features speaking of Eastern sophistication. She's clearly, unmistakably, impossibly 6 months pregnant, her emerald traveling dress straining across a belly that announces her condition to every shocked observer like a bell-tolling scandal across the territory. The whispers erupt instantaneously, spreading through the gathered crowd like wildfire racing across drought-stricken prairie grass, each voice adding to the crescendo of judgment and speculation that fills the air with poisonous speculation. "Did you see the size of—" One woman begins before her companion cuts her off with an equally scandalized, "That poor Mr. Bridger doesn't have the slightest idea what's coming his way, the poor deceived fool," while the men exchange knowing glances that speak volumes about their assumptions regarding the character of a woman who would arrive in such a condition to marry a man she's never met. And through it all, standing at the very edge of the gathering crowd with his weathered Stetson pulled low over eyes that have seen too much hardship to be easily shocked, Colt Bridger grips a crumpled letter in his calloused, work-hardened hands. The paper that changed the entire trajectory of his lonely existence 3 months ago, now seeming like a cruel joke played by a fate that has never been particularly kind to him, and nobody, not the gossiping townsfolk, not the self-righteous matrons clutching their pearls, not even the woman herself standing there trembling with exhaustion and fear, can possibly predict what happens next or how this moment will reshape not just 2 lives, but the entire social fabric of this small Montana community. Colt Bridger stands motionless while the chaos swirls around him like a tornado of judgment and speculation, his 6'3" frame as solid and unmovable as the mountains that tower in the purple distance beyond the town's modest buildings. And he feels the weight of every eye upon him, even as his own gaze remains locked on the woman who has stepped into his life carrying secrets that threaten to destroy the fragile hope he'd allowed himself to nurture over the past months of correspondence. The 34-year-old rancher had placed that advertisement for a wife out of desperation so profound it had kept him awake through countless lonely nights on his sprawling cattle ranch, the Broken Spur, which stretched across 2,000 acres of some of the most beautiful and unforgiving land that God ever created, needing not just a woman's touch to make the rough-hewn ranch house feel like something more than a bachelor's lonely outpost, but also needing to present the appearance of stability and family that the territorial bank demanded before they would extend his operating loan for another season. The responses to his carefully worded advertisement had been disappointingly few, most of them from women whose letters revealed desperation of their own or a mercenary interest in whatever wealth they imagined a Montana rancher might possess. But one letter had stood out like a beacon in the darkness of his prospects. A letter from Miss Evangeline Rose Hartwell of Boston, Massachusetts, written in elegant, educated script that spoke of refinement and grace and a gentle spirit that seemed to reach across the vast distance between the civilized East and the wild frontier to touch something deep within his guarded heart. She had described herself as a school teacher who had recently lost her husband to consumption, seeking a fresh start in the West where the painful memories of her loss wouldn't haunt every street corner and familiar face. And her photograph, carefully wrapped in brown paper and sent with her 3rd letter, had shown a delicate woman with kind amber eyes and honey-colored hair, arranged in the Eastern fashion. her expression simultaneously vulnerable and strong in a way that had stirred something Colt thought had died years ago when Margaret Sullivan had broken his heart and his pride by running off 2 weeks before their wedding. He had written back to Evangeline immediately, his own rough handwriting a stark contrast to her refined penmanship, and over the course of 2 months they had exchanged letters that grew increasingly personal, sharing hopes and fears and dreams for a future that had seemed just yesterday like it might actually come true until he had finally sent the money for her passage west, counting down the days until her arrival with an anticipation that embarrassed him with its intensity, never once imagining that the woman stepping off that stagecoach would be carrying a secret that would test every principle he'd built his life upon. But the woman descending from the stagecoach with careful, exhausted movements, while unmistakably the same delicate beauty from the photograph that Colt has studied so many times he could draw her features from memory, carries a burden that wasn't mentioned in any of her carefully composed letters, and the sight of her condition sends a shock through his system that feels like being kicked by an ornery mule. Her emerald traveling dress, though clearly well-made and expensive by frontier standards, strains noticeably across her swollen belly, the fabric pulling in ways that make her pregnancy impossible to conceal or deny, and her face still beautiful despite the still pallor of exhaustion and the violet shadows beneath her eyes that speak of sleepless nights and profound worry, holds an expression of such naked fear and desperate hope that it cuts through Colt's shock like a knife through butter. She clutches a worn leather satchel in one trembling hand while steadying herself against the dusty side of the stagecoach with the other, her movements careful and deliberate in the way of women who carry precious cargo within their bodies. And when her amber eyes meet his across the gathered crowd, he sees in their depths a plea for understanding and mercy that wars with a pride that refuses to beg for what she knows she doesn't deserve. The town of Redemption Falls, all 300 souls of it, seems to hold its collective breath in anticipation of the confrontation that everyone knows must come. Because this is the kind of scandal that will be discussed and dissected for years to come. The story that will be told and retold until it becomes legend, embellished with each telling until the truth becomes impossible to separate from fiction. Prudence Whitmore, the banker's wife and self-appointed moral guardian of the entire town, whose own past contains secrets she guards more carefully than the family silver, gasps audibly with a hand pressed dramatically to her ample bosom, her voice carrying across the street with theatrical horror as she announces to anyone within hearing distance, "Well, I have never in all my born days witnessed such brazen deception and moral degradation, and that poor Mr. Bridger standing there like a fool who doesn't know he's been made the laughingstock of the entire territory." Sheriff Tobias Kane, a practical man in his 50s who has seen enough of human nature's complications to reserve judgment, removes his hat and runs a hand through his graying hair, clearly uncertain whether his official capacity requires him to intervene in what might become a public disturbance. While Reverend Josiah Cumberland shifts his considerable weight from one foot to the other, his Bible pressed against his chest like a shield against the moral complexity of the situation unfolding before his eyes, silently debating whether Christian charity requires him to step forward or whether discretion demands he remain a neutral observer. The other townsfolk, ranchers with sun-weathered faces and hands gnarled from years of hard labor, shopkeepers who depend on maintaining good relationships with everyone regardless of scandal, saloon girls who know better than most that life circumstances can force good people into desperate situations, and drifters who have their own reasons for avoiding judgment of others. All wait with bated breath to see how Colt Bridger, a man known throughout the territory for his iron principles and unshakable honesty, for his word being as solid as the mountains themselves, will react to this public deception that has made him the object of pity and speculation. Colt moves, through the gathered crowd with the quiet, commanding authority of a man who has faced down stampeding cattle and armed outlaws without flinching, who has survived Montana winters that would break lesser men and droughts that destroyed his neighbors' dreams, his boots striking the dusty street with deliberate purpose as the crowd parts before him like the Red Sea before Moses, every eye tracking his movement toward the woman who stands trembling beside the stagecoach, awaiting her judgment. He stands 6'3" of solid muscle and sun-bronzed skin that speaks of years spent working under the unforgiving Montana sun, his dark hair touched with premature gray at the temples that makes him look older than his 34 years. His face all hard angles and weathered planes that reveal nothing of the turmoil churning beneath his stoic exterior. And his blue eyes, usually as cold and clear as a mountain stream running over ancient stones, flicker with something unreadable and complex, as he approaches Evangeline with measured steps that seem to last an eternity for the woman waiting to hear her fate. She lifts her chin with surprising dignity despite the obvious terror that makes her hands shake and her breath come in short, shallow gasps, her Eastern breeding and schoolteacher's composure providing her with armor against the judgment she can feel radiating from every direction. And when she speaks, her Boston accent is clear and refined, each word carefully enunciated despite the tremor that threatens to break through her fragile control. "Mr. Bridger," she says, her voice carrying just far enough for the nearest observers to hear and then relay to those farther back in the crowd. "I owe you an explanation, and I owe you an apology for the deception I have perpetrated through my correspondence, and I understand completely if you wish to put me back on the next stagecoach heading east, though I confess I'm not certain where I would go or what I would do, as I have burned every bridge behind me in coming here." "That you do, ma'am," Colt replies, his deep voice carrying across the street with the resonance of distant thunder rolling across the plains, his tone revealing nothing of his thoughts or intentions, and the crowd leans in collectively, eager for the confrontation they've been anticipating, already composing in their minds the versions of this story they'll tell their families over supper and their friends over whiskey. Each embellishment adding to the legend of the day Colt Bridger was made a fool. Evangeline's carefully maintained composure cracks ever so slightly, a single tear escaping to slide down her pale cheek, leaving a glistening trail that catches the afternoon sunlight. But she doesn't look away from Colt's intense gaze, doesn't allow herself the coward's refuge of averting her eyes, instead meeting his stare with a directness that speaks of courage born from having nothing left to lose. "I understand if you want to send me back on the next stage east," she continues, her voice growing stronger even as more tears threaten to fall. "And I have just enough money remaining from what you sent for my passage to purchase a ticket to somewhere, though I confess I haven't determined where that somewhere might be, as there is nowhere left that wants me." Colt raises one calloused hand, the gesture silencing her mid-sentence, and for a moment that stretches into eternity for Evangeline. He simply looks at her, his blue eyes searching her face for something that only he can identify. And then, in a move that sends shockwaves of astonishment rippling through every witness gathered on that dusty street, he removes his worn leather jacket, the one he's owned for 15 years and has worn through countless seasons of work and weather, and drapes it around her trembling shoulders with a gentleness that seems at odds with his rough exterior, the gesture somehow more intimate than any embrace. "You look about ready to collapse where you stand, Miss Hartwell," he says, his voice softer now but still carrying to the eager ears of the crowd. "And I reckon whatever needs discussing between us can wait until you're rested and fed and not swaying on your feet from exhaustion. So we'll talk at the ranch where prying eyes and wagging tongues won't turn our private business into public entertainment." He turns to the stagecoach driver, a grizzled man named Silas Crocker who has been running this route for 20 years and thought he'd seen everything until today, and says with clear authority that brooks no argument, "Bring her trunk to my wagon and be quick about it." The crowd erupts in shocked murmurs that build to a roar of speculation and disbelief, the sound washing over Evangeline like a wave that threatens to pull her under. And Prudence Whitmore's already crimson face turns an even deeper shade of outraged purple as she sputters her protest loud enough for half the town to hear. "Mr. Bridger, you cannot possibly mean to the impropriety of it all. That woman is clearly carrying another man's child, and you're just going to accept her deception without demanding an explanation right here and now, where decent people can witness that justice is served?" Her voice rises with each word until she's practically shrieking her moral indignation at the heavens themselves. Colt's gaze swings toward Prudence Whitmore with such intensity and barely contained fury that the woman actually takes an involuntary step backward, suddenly remembering that Colt Bridger is not a man to be trifled with, that he has a reputation for being slow to anger but terrible in his wrath when finally provoked, and his voice when he speaks carries a warning that only a fool would ignore. "Mrs. Whitmore, I don't recall asking for your counsel on this or any other matter concerning my personal affairs, and I'd thank you to keep your opinions to yourself unless you want to explain to your husband why I've decided to move my considerable banking business to the new bank over in Copper Creek, seeing as how I prefer to do business with people who understand the meaning of discretion and respect." He offers his arm to Evangeline with old-fashioned courtesy that seems to come naturally despite the extraordinary circumstances, his voice gentling as he addresses her directly. "Ma'am, if you're able to walk to my wagon, I'd be obliged for the company on the ride out to the ranch, but if you're too tired, I can carry you. And don't worry about what these folks think, because half of them have skeletons in their own closets that would make your situation look like Sunday school." Evangeline stares at him with eyes wide with bewilderment, and the first fragile shoots of hope beginning to push through the soil of her despair, her voice emerging as barely more than a whisper that only Colt can hear, as she tries to make sense of his inexplicable kindness. "But you don't understand, Mr. Bridger. I'm 6 months pregnant with another man's child, and I deceived you in every letter I wrote, and you have every right to denounce me here and now as the liar and fallen woman that I am. I can see perfectly well that you're carrying a child, Miss Hartwell, and I suspect my eyesight is considerably better than you give me credit for." Colt responds with the faintest hint of dry humor threading through his words. "And I can also see that you're exhausted from traveling halfway across this great country of ours in your condition, swaying on your feet like a sapling in a strong wind. And whatever truth needs telling between us can wait until you've had proper rest and a decent meal in your belly, because I've found that difficult conversations go better when both parties aren't liable to collapse from exhaustion halfway through them." As Colt helps Evangeline into his wagon with careful hands that avoid her belly with respectful deliberation, as he loads her worn trunk into the back with an ease that speaks of his considerable strength, the town of Redemption Falls descends into the kind of chaos that will fuel gossip for months to come, each person racing to be the first to spread their version of events to those who weren't fortunate enough to witness the scandal firsthand. The saloon will be buzzing with speculation tonight, every table filled with men arguing about Colt Bridger's motivations and sanity, and bets are already being placed at the Lucky Horseshoe on how many days or hours it will take before he sends the pregnant bride packing back to wherever she came from, with some cynical souls wagering that he's gone soft in the head from too many lonely years, while others who know him better suggest darkly that he's planning to extract the full story before making his decision about her fate, perhaps using the time to devise some elaborate revenge for her deception. But what none of them know, what even Evangeline sitting rigid and confused beside him in the wagon doesn't yet understand, is that Colt Bridger has his own desperate secrets, his own compelling reasons for needing this mail-order bride arrangement to work regardless of the complications she's brought with her. Because the Broken Spur Ranch is mortgaged to the hilt with debts that would make a grown man weep, and the territorial bank has given him exactly 6 months to prove he can turn a profit substantial enough to justify their continued investment. Or they'll seize everything. The land his father died working, the cattle he spent years breeding, the house he built with his own hands, and take it all to auction where it will be bought for pennies on the dollar by wealthy Eastern speculators who will never understand what this land means to those who've bled for it. A man alone, the bank president had argued with infuriating condescension, couldn't possibly manage an operation of this scope efficiently enough to be profitable. But a married man with a family and stability might convince them otherwise, might demonstrate the kind of responsibility and forward thinking that justified their financial risk. And Colt had gambled everything he owned and everything he dreamed of on this mail-order bride solving his problems, on her helping him present the image of domestic stability that would satisfy the bean counters back east who controlled his fate. As the wagon rolls out of town with its cargo of secrets and desperate hopes, following the dusty road that leads 5 miles north to where the Broken Spur Ranch lies nestled in the shadow of the towering Rockies, Evangeline sits rigid beside Colt, her spine straight despite her exhaustion. Her hands folded protectively over the swell of her belly where her child grows, blissfully unaware of the complicated circumstances of its impending birth. "Why?" she finally whispers, the single word carrying the weight of 1,000 questions, her voice barely audible over the creak of the wagon wheels and the clip-clop of the horse's hooves on the packed earth. "Why didn't you humiliate me in front of all those people the way I deserved? Why didn't you demand answers right there in the street where everyone could witness your justified anger? Why did you show me any kindness at all when I've done nothing but deceive you from the very first letter I wrote?" Colt keeps his eyes fixed on the road ahead, on the path that leads to his ranch, and whatever future they might manage to salvage from this disaster, his jaw working as he considers his response. And when he finally speaks, his words are measured and careful, revealing just enough truth to answer her question without exposing the full depth of his own desperation. "Because, Miss Hartwell, I suspect that we're both running from something, both desperately trying to outrun our pasts and build something new from the wreckage of our previous lives. And I've learned in my years on this earth that people who've got nowhere else to go, who've burned their bridges and exhausted their options, need to stick together if they're going to survive in this unforgiving country, because God knows nobody else is going to extend them any grace or second chances." The answer only deepens Evangeline's confusion and her cautious, fragile hope that perhaps this terrifying gamble she's taken in coming west might not end in complete disaster. And as the wagon carries them toward an uncertain future, both of them sit in silence, each lost in thoughts about what they've risked and what they might yet lose. Neither of them able to predict how this arrangement born of mutual desperation will transform into something neither of them saw coming. Something that will challenge everything they thought they knew about themselves and about what it means to build a life with another person. And as the sun begins its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that seem to set the clouds on fire, Evangeline wonders what secrets Colt Bridger is hiding behind those unreadable blue eyes. What demons he's running from that would make him willing to accept a pregnant mail-order bride when any sane man would have sent her packing. And that question, burning in her mind like a coal that refuses to be extinguished, will haunt her through the long night ahead and drive her determination to understand the man who has inexplicably offered her salvation when she expected only condemnation. The Broken Spur Ranch sprawls across 2,000 acres of Montana Territory's most breathtakingly beautiful and simultaneously most unforgiving land. A vast expanse of rolling grassland dotted with stands of pine and aspen that whisper secrets in the mountain wind, and the main house built from sturdy timber and native stone by Colt's own hands over the course of 2 back-breaking years, sits proudly on a gentle rise that overlooks grazing pastures where hundreds of Hereford cattle with their distinctive white faces and Russet bodies dot the landscape like living rubies scattered across green velvet, while in the distance the Rocky Mountains tower with their peaks still crowned in brilliant white snow even in the warmth of late spring, creating a vista so magnificent that Evangeline, despite her exhaustion and anxiety about the conversation that awaits her, cannot help but draw in a sharp breath of wonder at the raw, untamed beauty of this place that might become her home if fate and Colt Bridger's mercy allow it. The wagon follows a well-worn track through a wooden gate that bears the ranch's brand, a horseshoe broken cleanly in half. And as they approach the house, Evangeline notices the careful attention to detail that speaks of a man who takes pride in his work. From the neatly maintained fences that stretch toward the horizon, to the well-tended kitchen garden beside the house where rows of vegetables grow in orderly precision, and she feels a pang of guilt knowing that her deception has brought chaos into this ordered world that Colt has clearly worked so hard to build from nothing. Colt brings the wagon to a halt in front of the house and moves around to help Evangeline down, with the same careful gentleness he showed in town. His large hands warm and steady on her waist as he lifts her from the high seat, and she notices how meticulously he avoids any contact with her swollen belly. His touch respectful and almost impersonal despite the intimacy of the gesture, as though he's afraid that acknowledging her pregnancy too directly might somehow make the situation more real and more complicated than it already is. The front door opens before they reach it, and a weathered Mexican woman in her 50s emerges onto the porch, wiping flour-dusted hands on the apron tied around her still slender waist, her dark eyes bright with intelligence and warmth that seems to radiate from her sun-bronzed face. And when those eyes land on Evangeline and travel from her face down to her, obviously pregnant belly, they widen with shock that the woman makes no attempt to conceal, her mouth opening as though to speak before she catches herself and glances at Colt with an expression that mingles concern, confusion, and something that might be sympathy. "Colt, you didn't mention in any of your letters that she was—" the woman begins, her English flavored with the musical accent of her native Spanish. But she stops mid-sentence as propriety and compassion wore visibly across her expressive features, her natural kindness apparently winning out over her surprise as she descends the porch steps to stand before them. "Consuela Martinez, this is Miss Evangeline Rose Hartwell, soon to be Mrs. Bridger if she still agrees after we've had a chance to talk things through properly," Colt says with a formality that seems at odds with the obvious affection in his voice when he speaks to the older woman, and then turning to Evangeline he continues with genuine warmth that she hasn't heard from him until this moment. "Miss Hartwell, Consuela has been keeping house and cooking for me these past 10 years, ever since her husband Miguel died and left her alone, and she's the closest thing to family I've got left in this world. Which is to say, she's earned the right to speak her mind to me without fear of consequences, even when her mind speaking is inconvenient or uncomfortable for me to hear." Consuela's weathered face breaks into a smile that transforms her from merely handsome to genuinely beautiful, the kind of beauty that comes from a spirit that has weathered hardship without becoming hardened. And she steps forward to take both of Evangeline's trembling hands in her own work-roughened ones, her grip warm and reassuring in a way that makes Evangeline's carefully controlled emotions threaten to overflow. "Come inside, mija, because you look like you're about to collapse right here in the yard, and whatever story needs telling can wait until you've had a proper bath and some food in your belly and maybe even a short rest. Because I can see in your eyes that you haven't slept properly in days, maybe weeks, and a woman in your condition needs rest more than she needs explanations or conversations that can wait another hour or two." She shoots Colt a look that clearly communicates her opinion about men who would keep a pregnant woman standing in the yard when there's a perfectly good house with comfortable furniture just steps away. And he has the grace to look slightly abashed as he picks up Evangeline's trunk as though it weighs no more than a hat box and carries it toward the house. "The guest room, Consuela, if you'd be so kind as to prepare it," Colt says as he climbs the porch steps, and the simple statement carries implications that Evangeline doesn't immediately understand, her exhausted mind struggling to process the significance of his words, until Consuela has ushered her into the house and she finds herself standing in a spacious main room that speaks of masculine practicality tempered with unexpected touches of comfort. A stone fireplace large enough to roast a whole pig, furniture that while rough-hewn is nonetheless well-crafted and sturdy, windows that let in floods of golden afternoon light, and braided rugs on the wooden floor that add warmth and color to what might otherwise be a austere bachelor's dwelling. The guest room? Evangeline finally manages to ask, her voice emerging small and confused as she looks from Consuela to Colt and back again, trying to understand the sleeping arrangements being proposed and what they might mean for her immediate future and her tenuous position in this household. Colt sets her trunk down at the base of the stairs that lead to the second floor and turns to face her, his expression serious but not unkind, his blue eyes meeting hers with a directness that makes her feel simultaneously exposed and somehow safer than she's felt in months. "We're not married yet, Miss Hartwell, not in the eyes of God or the law or this community. And it wouldn't be proper for us to share sleeping quarters until we've sorted out whether we're actually going through with this arrangement, so you'll have your own room with a door that locks from the inside, and you'll have privacy and safety and time to decide what you really want to do without feeling pressured by proximity or impropriety or any obligation beyond what you choose to accept." He heads toward what she assumes must be his own bedroom, calling back over his shoulder as he goes, "I'll leave you ladies to get settled, and we'll talk over supper once you've had a chance to rest and collect yourself." After Evangeline has bathed in a copper tub that Consuela fills with gloriously hot water carried up from the kitchen stove, after she has washed away the dust and grime of weeks of travel, and changed into a simple cotton dress from her limited wardrobe that accommodates her expanding figure without the constriction of her traveling clothes, after she has rested for an hour on a bed so comfortable she nearly weeps with the relief of lying on a real mattress instead of stagecoach benches and cheap hotel cots, she makes her way downstairs following the incredible aromas of roasting meat and baking bread that fill the house with scents that make her stomach clench with hunger she hasn't properly acknowledged in days. Consuela has set the dining room table with more care than a simple supper between strangers would seem to warrant, using what must be the house's best dishes and even placing a small jar of wildflowers in the center. And when Colt emerges from his room wearing a fresh shirt with his dark hair still damp from his own washing, Evangeline feels a flutter of nervousness that has nothing to do with her pregnancy and everything to do with the reckoning she knows is coming. The conversation where she must lay bare all her sins and hope that this stranger's mercy extends far, enough to encompass the magnitude of her deception. The meal Consuela serves them is magnificent. Roast beef that falls apart at the touch of a fork, potatoes roasted with herbs from the kitchen garden, fresh bread still warm from the oven with butter that Consuela churns herself, and vegetables prepared with the kind of care that speaks of genuine affection for the people being fed. And it's the first proper meal Evangeline has consumed in what feels like forever. The first time in weeks that she's eaten anything more substantial than the meager rations she could afford at stage stops or the stale sandwiches she purchased from station masters who looked at her swelling belly with expressions ranging from pity to contempt. She eats with an appetite that would embarrass her under normal circumstances, but Colt watches her with what might be approval rather than judgment, saying nothing as she accepts second helpings of everything Consuela offers, and when the housekeeper finally clears the dishes and disappears into the kitchen with a knowing look that suggests she's giving them privacy for the difficult conversation ahead, Evangeline feels her brief respite from anxiety come crashing to an end. Finally, when Consuela has bid them good night and retreated to her own small cottage on the property, leaving the newlyweds to be alone in the lamplight that casts dancing shadows across the dining room walls, Colt pours 2 glasses of cool water from a pitcher beaded with condensation and settles back in his chair with a posture that manages to be both relaxed and somehow alert. His blue eyes fixed on Evangeline's face with an intensity that makes her want to look away. But her pride refuses to allow. I figure you've got a story to tell, Miss Hartwell, and after feeding you and giving you rest, I reckon I've earned the right to hear it, and I'd appreciate it if you'd give me the truth this time. The whole truth without the careful omissions and artful deceptions that characterized your letters, because whatever we decide to do going forward needs to be built on honesty, rather than the kind of pretty lies that make everything seem simpler than it really is. Evangeline's hands tremble as she sets down her water glass, the crystal catching the lamplight and sending prismatic reflections dancing across the white tablecloth. And she takes a deep breath that does nothing to steady her racing heart or calm the nausea that has nothing to do with her pregnancy and everything to do with the shame of confessing her fall from grace to this man who has shown her kindness she doesn't deserve. I lied to you in my letters, not about everything, because some of what I wrote was true, but about the most important things. The things that would have made you reject my suit immediately if you'd known them from the beginning. And I have no excuse except desperation and the kind of fear that makes people do things they never imagined themselves capable of doing. Her voice wavers but holds, and she forces herself to continue, to not look away from those penetrating blue eyes that seem to see straight through to her soul. I was a school teacher in Boston. That part was entirely true, and I was good at my work, devoted to my students, respected by the parents and the school board, living a respectable life in a respectable boarding house and attending church every Sunday like a proper Christian woman should. But I was also engaged to be married, engaged to a man named Harrison Caldwell, who was the son of one of Boston's most prominent bankers. And he was handsome and charming and attentive in all the ways that a naive young woman dreams her suitor will be. And I believed with my whole heart that he loved me the way I had foolishly allowed myself to love him. I gathered that part, Colt says quietly, his expression unreadable as he waits for her to continue, giving her the space to tell her story at her own pace without interruption or judgment, at least not yet. She takes another shaking breath and continues, the words coming faster now as though she needs to purge them from her system like poison. After we became intimate, after I gave him what I should have saved for our wedding night, but he convinced me that we were as good as married already and that God would forgive us our impatience because our love was so pure and true, after I discovered that I was carrying his child and went to him immediately with the news, thinking he would be pleased or at least willing to move up our wedding date so that the baby would be born to married parents and no one would need to know about our transgression. He laughed in my face with a cruelty I hadn't known he possessed. The memory clearly still wounds her deeply, her voice breaking slightly before she forces it steady again through sheer willpower. He told me that he was already engaged, truly engaged with a contract and a date set, to Rebecca Ashford, who was the daughter of the governor of Massachusetts, and that our supposed engagement had been nothing more than a fiction, a game to amuse himself while the real arrangements for his advantageous marriage were being finalized by lawyers and fathers in smoke-filled rooms. And he had the audacity to offer me money to either take care of the problem, as he so delicately phrased it, or to disappear somewhere far away where I wouldn't embarrass him or complicate his real life with my inconvenient existence and my even more inconvenient pregnancy. "What did you do?" Colt asks, and Evangeline notices that his hands have formed into fists where they rest on the table, his knuckles white with tension that suggests he's imagining what he might do to Harrison Caldwell if the man were standing before him right now. I slapped him hard enough to leave a mark on his privileged face, hard enough that my hand stung for an hour afterward, and then I walked out of his office with what remained of my dignity and tried to figure out how to survive what was coming next. Because the damage was already done and the consequences were inevitable. Evangeline swallows hard. fighting back tears that threatened to overwhelm her composure. Somehow word spread through Boston society with the speed that scandal always travels in close-knit communities. His friends, I suspect, found it amusing to share the story of how their companion had ruined a school teacher and discarded her like yesterday's newspaper. And within a single week, I had lost everything I'd spent years building. My teaching position was terminated with immediate effect and no references provided. My landlady evicted me with only 24 hours' notice and kept my security deposit as punishment for my moral failings. The church I'd attended faithfully for 5 years made it clear through whispers and turned backs that I was no longer welcome in their congregation, and even my own family, my own flesh and blood, turned their backs on me when I needed the most. Your family abandoned you? Colt's voice carries a note of disbelief mixed with anger. Because whatever his faults, family loyalty is clearly something he values deeply, and the idea of turning away one's own child in their hour of greatest need seems to offend his fundamental sense of what's right. Evangeline nods, a single tear escaping to trace down her cheek despite her best efforts to maintain control. My father is a minister, a man who preaches forgiveness and Christian charity from his pulpit every Sunday morning to his respectable congregation. But when I appeared on his doorstep desperate and pregnant and begging for help, for just a place to stay until I could figure out what to do next, he called me a Jezebel and a whore who had brought shame upon his house and his good name. And he shut the door in my face while my mother stood behind him weeping but too weak or too compliant to overrule his judgment, and I stood on that doorstep in the rain realizing that I was truly alone in the world with nowhere to turn and no one to help me. She meets Colt's eyes directly now, her own amber gaze fierce with pride despite her tears. I had exactly $70 to my name, money I'd saved from my teaching salary over the course of 3 years, and nowhere to go and no prospects for employment because no respectable establishment would hire a visibly pregnant, unmarried woman, and I was sitting in a cheap boarding house trying to calculate how long my money would last and what I would do when it ran out, when I happened to see your advertisement in the Boston Globe that someone had left in the common room. Colt leans forward slightly, his expression intent as he listens to her explain the chain of desperate circumstances that led her to his doorstep, and Evangeline continues with her confession, determined now to tell him everything and let the chips fall where they may. Your advertisement said, honest rancher seeks respectable woman for marriage, must be of good character and willing to work hard and able to handle the challenges of frontier life. And I knew I was lying when I sat down to compose my response, knew I was deceiving you by presenting myself as a widowed schoolteacher seeking a fresh start rather than a ruined woman carrying another man's bastard child. But I told myself that maybe, just maybe, if you met me first and saw that I could work and that I wasn't some floozy or loose woman, that I was educated and capable and willing to be a true partner, you might be willing to overlook my condition or at least give me a chance to prove my worth before casting judgment. She pauses, gathering her courage for the final admission. I planned to tell you the truth, I swear I did. Planned to confess everything the moment I arrived so that you could make an informed decision about whether to proceed with the marriage. But when that stagecoach door opened and I saw all those people gathered and staring with their judging eyes and their whispered speculation, I froze like a coward. And then you were there in front of me, looking so much taller and more intimidating than I'd imagined from your letters. And I thought you were going to humiliate me right there in front of the entire town, denounce me as the liar I am and send me away with nothing, and I couldn't find my voice to explain or apologize or anything. But I didn't humiliate you, Colt says, and it's not quite a question, more like a statement inviting her to acknowledge what happened. No, you showed me a kindness I didn't deserve and still don't understand, and that's why I'm sitting here now trying to give you the honesty I should have given you from the very beginning. because you've earned that much and more through your inexplicable mercy. Evangeline sits back in her chair, exhausted from the emotional purging of her confession, and waits for Colt's judgment, for the anger or disappointment or disgust that she's certain must come, now that he knows the full extent of her deception and moral failure. For a long moment that seems to stretch into eternity, Colt is silent, his blue eyes studying her face as though trying to read something written there in a language only he can understand. And then he stands abruptly and walks to the window, looking out at his land bathed in the silvery light of the rising moon. His broad shoulders tense with some emotion Evangeline cannot identify. 8 years ago, I was engaged to be married myself, he begins, his voice low and rough with old pain that clearly still affects him despite the passage of time. And her name was Margaret Sullivan, and she was the prettiest girl in 3 counties, the daughter of the wealthiest rancher in the entire territory. A woman who could have had her pick of any man from here to Denver, but who chose me, or so I believed. And we were planning a summer wedding that was supposed to be the social event of the season. Evangeline watches him, sensing that he's sharing something he rarely discusses, offering her his own painful history as a kind of exchange for the vulnerability she's shown him, and she waits silently for him to continue. 2 weeks before the ceremony was scheduled to take place, 2 weeks before I was supposed to become the happiest man in Montana territory, she ran off with a railroad man who was passing through town. Some smooth-talking son of a bitch from Chicago with fancy clothes and fancier promises. And she left me a note, just a goddamn note after 2 years of courtship and promises, saying she couldn't face a life of hardship on a struggling ranch, that she wanted comfort and excitement and all the things a simple rancher could never give her. And she took my ring and my pride and my ability to trust anyone's promises, and she rode away on that eastbound train without looking back. Colt's jaw tightens with remembered humiliation, his reflection in the window glass showing an expression of such raw pain that Evangeline wants to go to him but doesn't dare. The whole territory knew within days, because scandal travels fast in small communities where entertainment is scarce. And everywhere I went, I saw the pitying looks and heard the whispered speculation about what I'd done wrong or what I'd lacked that made her choose someone else. And I swore to myself and to God that I would never, ever let anyone make me feel that small and pathetic again. That I would build my ranch into something so successful that Margaret Sullivan would regret her choice every day for the rest of her shallow life. I'm so very sorry that happened to you, Evangeline says softly, beginning to understand the walls he's built around his heart and the reasons why he might sympathize with someone else who's been betrayed and abandoned. He turns back to face her, his expression now carefully neutral, all emotion locked away behind the mask of control he spent years perfecting. After Margaret left, I focused every ounce of my energy and attention on building the Broken Spur into the finest cattle operation in the territory. Working 16-hour days, 7 days a week, improving my bloodlines and expanding my acreage and doing everything right. But the bank doesn't care how good your cattle are or how hard you work if you're a bachelor without family or stability, because they think a man alone is a bad investment. Too likely to make rash decisions or get himself killed doing something stupid without a wife to civilize him and give him reasons to be careful. His blue eyes lock on hers with an intensity that makes her breath catch. I need a wife, Miss Hartwell, not because I'm lonely or because I'm looking for love or companionship, but because the bank has given me exactly 6 months to prove I can turn a profit substantial enough to justify their continued investment, or they'll seize everything I've built and auction it off to the highest bidder, and a married man with a family has a much better chance of convincing those bean-counting bastards back east that I'm a stable, responsible investment than a bachelor working himself to death alone. The revelation hits Evangeline like a physical blow, the realization that he needs her as desperately as she needs him, that they're both using each other to escape impossible situations, And somehow this knowledge makes her feel less like a charity case and more like an equal partner in a mutually beneficial arrangement. So you're proposing a business arrangement, a marriage of convenience where we each get what we need from the other without the messy complications of actual feelings or expectations beyond the practical, she asks, trying to keep her voice steady and businesslike despite the unexpected ache in her chest at the thought of a marriage without even the possibility of love. I'm proposing that we make the best of our respective situations and help each other survive what we couldn't survive alone, Colt says, moving back to the table and sitting down across from her with his hands folded in front of him like a man conducting a business negotiation. I won't pretend to love you or court you with pretty words and romantic gestures because I'm not capable of that kind of foolishness anymore after what Margaret did to me. But I can promise you that you'll be treated with respect and dignity, that you'll have a home and security and everything you need to raise your child in comfort, and that child you're carrying will have my name and my protection and will grow up as a Bridger with all the rights and privileges that entails, and in return you help me convince the bank that I'm a stable family man worth investing in, and you learn the ranch operations well enough to be a true partner in running this place. Evangeline stands, her hand moving instinctively to rest protectively on her swollen belly where her child grows, blissfully unaware of the negotiations being conducted about its future. And she looks at this complicated man who is offering her salvation wrapped in such coldly practical terms. And what if I refuse your offer? What if I choose to take my chances elsewhere and spare you the complications that come with a pregnant bride? She asks, needing to know if she truly has a choice or if desperation has already made the decision for her. Then I'll give you enough money to start fresh somewhere else, enough to see you through your lying in and get you established in some city where nobody knows your history. And I'll do it with no strings attached and no expectations of repayment or gratitude. Because despite what you might think, I'm not the kind of man who would leave a woman in your condition with nothing just because things didn't work out the way I'd hoped. Colt's expression is sincere, his offer genuine, and Evangeline realizes with a start that he really would let her go if she asked, that he's giving her the choice that no one else has offered since this nightmare began. But I'll tell you straight and honest, Miss Hartwell, that life is desperately hard for a woman alone with a child and no husband and no family support, and out here in Montana territory at least you'd have my protection and my name and a purpose beyond just surviving day to day. And your child would grow up with opportunities and security instead of poverty and shame. The offer hangs in the air between them like a tangible thing, simultaneously a lifeline and a trap, salvation and sacrifice, and Evangeline knows that her answer will determine not just her own fate, but the fate of the innocent child growing inside her. And suddenly the weight of that responsibility threatens to crush her where she stands. But she straightens her spine and lifts her chin with the pride that has sustained her through months of degradation, and meets Colt Bridger's eyes with a directness that matches his own. Because if nothing else, she will face this decision with the same honesty he's shown her. And after a moment of internal struggle that feels like an eternity, she takes a deep breath and prepares to give her answer. But before she can speak, before she can commit herself irrevocably to this arrangement that will bind her life to his, a sudden commotion erupts outside, the thunder of hoofbeats approaching at speed, a man's voice shouting, and then Consuela bursting through the door without knocking, her face pale with alarm and her voice urgent as she announces that riders are approaching the ranch. At least a dozen of them armed and moving fast, and the lead rider is carrying a torch that illuminates a face Evangeline recognizes with a shock of horror that turns her blood to ice because somehow, impossibly, Harrison Caldwell has followed her across half a continent to this remote Montana ranch, and he's brought enough men with him to make it clear that he's not here for a friendly conversation, and whatever happens next will determine whether the Fragile hope of the future she and Colt have been negotiating survives the violent intrusion of her past into their present. The thunder of approaching hoofbeats grows louder with each passing second, reverberating through the floorboards of the ranch house like the drumbeat of an advancing army. And Evangeline feels her newly found hope crumbling into dust as she realizes that Harrison Caldwell, the man who destroyed her life and abandoned her to poverty and shame, has somehow tracked her across half a continent to this remote Montana ranch, bringing with him enough armed men to make his intentions unmistakably threatening, and she cannot fathom what would possess him to follow her here unless it's some twisted desire to ensure her complete destruction or to silence her permanently, so that she can never reveal the truth about his character to his wealthy, respectable bride-to-be. Colt moves with the fluid efficiency of a man accustomed to danger, crossing to the gun cabinet in 3 long strides and extracting a Winchester rifle that he checks with practiced hands, before tossing a second weapon to Consuela, who catches it with the ease of someone who knows her way around firearms, and then he turns to Evangeline with an expression that mingles protective fury with calm determination, as he says in a voice that brooks no argument, "Get upstairs to the guest room and lock the door, and don't come out until I tell you it's safe, because whatever business this man has here, you're under my protection now, and I'll be damned if I let anyone terrorize a woman in my own home." But Evangeline, despite the fear that makes her hands shake and her heart hammer against her ribs like a trapped bird trying to escape its cage, shakes her head with a stubborn determination that surprises even herself, because she has spent months running and hiding and allowing shame to dictate her choices. And she realizes with sudden clarity that she cannot begin a new life by cowering in the shadows while Colt Bridger fights her battles for her. No, this is my past coming to call, my mistakes and my consequences, and I won't hide behind you like a frightened child while you face whatever danger Harrison has brought to your doorstep because of me, she says, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins like ice water. And she sees something flicker in Colt's eyes that might be respect or admiration, or simply recognition that she possesses more courage than he'd given her credit for possessing. The riders pull to a halt in front of the ranch house in a cloud of dust that glows orange in the torchlight, and through the window Evangeline can see Harrison Caldwell sitting tall in his saddle, dressed in expensive Eastern clothes that look ridiculous and out of place in this rough frontier setting. His handsome face twisted with an expression of arrogant determination that she remembers all too well from the day he laughed at her desperate pleas and offered her money to disappear. Behind him are 12 men who look like the kind of hired muscle that wealthy families employ when they want unpleasant business handled with maximum intimidation and minimum legal complications, and the sight of them arrayed like an invading force sends a chill down Evangeline's spine, even as she forces herself to stand tall and refuse to give in to the paralytic fear that threatens to overwhelm her completely. Colt steps onto the porch with his rifle held loosely but ready, his posture radiating the kind of quiet confidence that comes from a man who has faced down threats before and survived them all. And when he speaks, his voice carries across the yard with an authority that seems to give even Harrison's hired men pause in their aggressive posturing. "This is private property and you're trespassing with what appears to be hostile intent, so I'll give you exactly 30 seconds to state your business before I start treating you like the cattle rustlers and claim jumpers who come onto my land uninvited, and I can promise you that won't end well for anyone involved, because Montana territory law is pretty clear about a man's right to defend his property against armed intruders who show up in the night making threats." Harrison Caldwell dismounts with the careful movements of a man unaccustomed to horses, his polished boots hitting the dusty ground with a soft thud that seems absurdly delicate compared to the thunderous arrival of his entourage. and he smooths his expensive coat before looking up at Colt with an expression of condescending superiority that suggests he believes money and Eastern breeding give him power even here in this wild country where such things matter far less than strength and character. "Mr. Bridger, I presume? I am Harrison Caldwell of the Boston Caldwells, and I'm here on a matter of utmost delicacy concerning a woman who I believe has taken refuge in your home under false pretenses. A Miss Evangeline Hartwell who is carrying my child and who absconded from Boston without giving me the opportunity to fulfill my responsibilities toward her and the unborn infant. And I've come to rectify this unfortunate situation by offering her the financial support she needs to raise the child in comfort far from here, perhaps in San Francisco, where the climate is more agreeable and the society more sophisticated than what she would find in this primitive territory." The audacity of Harrison's lies, delivered with such smooth confidence as though he truly believes Colt will accept his version of events without question, makes Evangeline's blood boil with a rage so intense she can taste it like copper on her tongue. And before Colt can respond, before she can even think about the wisdom of revealing herself, she steps out onto the porch beside him with her chin lifted high and her amber eyes blazing with righteous fury. "You lying, contemptible coward, how dare you stand there and claim you want to fulfill your responsibilities when you laughed in my face and called our child a problem to be eliminated or hidden away? When you offered me money to either murder our baby or disappear so that your precious engagement to the governor's daughter wouldn't be complicated by the inconvenient truth of your character," she says, her voice ringing out across the yard with such force that several of Harrison's hired men shift uncomfortably in their saddles, clearly not expecting this version of the story. "You didn't follow me here out of some newfound sense of paternal duty or concern for my welfare. You followed me because you're afraid, terrified that I might reveal the truth about what you did to someone who matters, someone who might damage your carefully constructed reputation or interfere with your advantageous marriage. And you brought all these men with you because you're fundamentally a coward who needs overwhelming force to feel powerful." Harrison's handsome face flushes an ugly red color that even the torchlight cannot conceal, his carefully maintained composure cracking to reveal the petulant cruelty beneath. And when he speaks again, his voice has lost its smooth veneer of civility and reveals the naked threat underneath his polite words. "You stupid, grasping whore, did you really think you could blackmail me by running to the frontier and finding some desperate cowboy to marry you and give my bastard a name? I've invested too much time and money into my future to let some schoolteacher with delusions of grandeur ruin everything I've worked for, so here's what's going to happen. You're going to take the $20,000 I'm offering. You're going to sign a legal document swearing that I'm not the father and releasing me from any claims you or the child might have against me or my estate. And then you're going to disappear into whatever hole will have you, or I will make sure that everyone in Boston and San Francisco and Denver and every other civilized city knows exactly what kind of woman you are, and I'll destroy whatever pathetic life you're trying to build here with this frontier nobody." The silence that follows Harrison's threat seems to vibrate with tension so thick it's almost visible, and Evangeline watches as Colt's expression transforms from merely dangerous to absolutely deadly, his blue eyes going cold as Arctic ice, and his jaw setting with a rigidity that speaks of rage barely contained beneath his iron self-control. "Let me make sure I understand the situation correctly," Colt says, his voice deceptively quiet in a way that makes it somehow more frightening than if he were shouting. "Because I want to be absolutely certain about what's happening on my property before I decide how to respond to it. You got this woman pregnant through promises you had no intention of keeping. You abandoned her when she needed you most. You allowed her to lose her job and her home and her family through your calculated cruelty, and now you've tracked her across half the continent not to make amends but to threaten her into silence with money and intimidation. so that your comfortable life won't be disturbed by the consequences of your own despicable actions. And you thought the best way to accomplish this goal was to bring a dozen armed men onto my land in the middle of the night, to terrorize a pregnant woman under my protection. Is that about the size of it? Harrison seems to recognize too late that he has badly miscalculated the situation, that whatever he expected from this confrontation, he did not anticipate facing a man like Colt Bridger, who clearly possesses both the strength and the moral conviction to stand against him. But his pride and his panic make him double down on his threats rather than retreat while he still can. I don't know what lies she's told you about our relationship, but the truth is that she seduced me, pursued me relentlessly despite my engagement to another woman, and now she's trying to trap me into supporting her and her bastard by running to some backward frontier where she thought I wouldn't follow. But I have resources and connections that stretch from Boston to San Francisco, and I will use every one of them to destroy both of you if you don't give me what I want right now. Colt sets his rifle against the porch railing with deliberate care, the gesture somehow more menacing than if he'd pointed it directly at Harrison, and then he descends the steps with measured strides that remind Evangeline of a wolf stalking prey. His considerable height and muscular build making Harrison look suddenly small and soft and utterly outmatched despite his dozen armed men watching from horseback. Here's what's actually going to happen, Mr. Caldwell of the Boston Caldwells, and I want you to listen very carefully because I'm only going to explain this once. And then we're moving directly to consequences if you're too stupid or too arrogant to understand the situation you've created for yourself, Colt says, stopping just a few feet from Harrison, who has to tilt his head back to meet his eyes. That woman standing on my porch is Evangeline Rose Bridger, my wife in the eyes of God in this territory. And the child she's carrying is my child by law and by choice, regardless of whose blood runs through its veins. Which means you have exactly zero claim on either of them and exactly zero right to come onto my property making demands or threats or offering money as though human beings can be bought and sold like cattle at auction. And if you or any of your hired thugs make one single move that I interpret as threatening toward my family, I will invoke Montana territory law regarding defense of property and kin. And these mountains are full of places where bodies are never found and questions are never asked. The transformation in Harrison's expression from arrogant confidence to genuine fear is almost comical, his face going pale as he realizes that his Eastern money and connections mean nothing out here where strength and conviction trump social standing. And several of his hired men begin shifting in their saddles as though reconsidering the wisdom of their employment, clearly understanding that Colt Bridger is not making idle threats but stating simple facts about how frontier justice operates. You can't just threaten to murder people because they've inconvenienced you, Harrison sputters, his voice rising to a pitch that sounds almost hysterical. I have friends in high places, connections to territorial governors and federal judges, and if anything happens to me, there will be investigations and consequences that will destroy you and your pitiful ranch. Colt's smile is cold and entirely devoid of humor, a baring of teeth that resembles a predator's warning more than any expression of amusement, and when he speaks again, his voice carries across the yard to ensure that every one of Harrison's men hears him clearly. Sheriff, Tobias Kane is a personal friend of mine who I've known for 15 years. And Reverend Cumberland, who married Evangeline and me just this afternoon, is the most respected man in 3 counties. And there are at least 20 witnesses in town who saw me claim this woman as my wife despite her condition, who watched me defend her honor against gossips and troublemakers. So if anything were to happen to you or your men on my property tonight after you arrived here making threats against my pregnant wife, I suspect the sheriff's investigation would conclude pretty quickly that you got exactly what you deserved for terrorizing a respectable married woman in her own home. And your friends in high places would find that frontier justice has already been served before they could even think about interfering. Evangeline watches this confrontation unfold with a mixture of terror and awe, seeing Colt Bridger transform before her eyes from the quiet, controlled man who offered her a business arrangement into something far more primal and protective. And she realizes that despite his claims about being incapable of caring, about this marriage being nothing more than a mutually beneficial transaction, he is defending her with a ferocity that speaks to something much deeper than mere practical considerations. Standing between her and danger like a wall of flesh and bone and righteous fury that will not be moved or intimidated regardless of the consequences. She steps forward, placing herself beside Colt despite the risk, despite knowing that her presence might escalate rather than diffuse the situation, because she needs Harrison to see that she is no longer the frightened, desperate woman he dismissed in Boston, that she has found not just shelter but genuine protection in this rough country, with this complicated man who values honor and loyalty above social standing and wealth. Harrison, I need you to understand something fundamental that your privileged upbringing apparently never taught you, Evangeline says, her voice carrying clearly across the tense silence that has fallen over the yard. Which is that some things cannot be bought or threatened or negotiated away, no matter how much money you offer or how many hired guns you bring to the table, and I am done being afraid of you and what you might do to my reputation or my future, because the worst has already happened and I survived it, and I've found something here that you will never understand or experience in your entire shallow, selfish existence. She reaches out and takes Colt's hand, feeling his calloused fingers close around hers with surprising gentleness, despite the violence radiating from every line of his body, and she continues with absolute conviction ringing through every word. I've found a man who values truth over convenience, who offers protection without demanding degradation in return, who is willing to raise another man's child as his own simply because it's the right thing to do, and that makes him worth 1,000 of you with all your money and connections and fine Eastern manners that hide a fundamentally corrupt soul. So take your $20,000 and your threats and your hired thugs and go back to Boston, marry your governor's daughter, live your comfortable life, and never ever come looking for me or my child again, because we are Bridgers now and we are beyond your reach forever. The finality in Evangeline's voice, the absolute certainty that she means every word she's saying, seems to penetrate even Harrison's self-absorbed panic. And he looks between her and Colt with an expression that mingles hatred and frustration, and perhaps even a glimmer of recognition that he has comprehensively lost this confrontation, that whatever he hoped to accomplish by following her to Montana territory has failed utterly and completely. You'll regret this decision when you're living in poverty with a half-breed brat and a husband who can barely keep his failing ranch afloat, he spits out venomously, making one last attempt to wound her with words since physical intimidation has proven ineffective. And when you come crawling back begging for my help, I'll laugh in your face the same way I did in Boston, and you'll spend the rest of your miserable life wishing you'd taken my money when you had the chance. Colt's hand tightens on the rifle he's retrieved from the porch railing, his entire body coiled like a spring ready to release violence. But Evangeline squeezes his hand gently, a silent communication that she needs to respond to this final insult herself, that she needs to close this chapter of her life with her own words rather than allowing Colt to speak for her. The only thing I regret, Harrison, is that I wasted 2 years of my life believing your lies and trusting your promises, but that mistake led me here to this place and this man, so perhaps it wasn't a mistake at all, but rather a necessary journey through darkness to find something real and true and worth fighting for. And I pity you. I genuinely pity you, because you will never know what it means to be loved for who you are rather than what you can provide. And your governor's daughter will spend her entire marriage to you wondering why she feels so hollow inside, despite all the comfort and luxury you can offer. And maybe one day when you're old and alone, despite being surrounded by family and fortune, you'll remember this night and realize what you threw away when you chose convenience over character. She pauses, then delivers her final words with quiet dignity that transforms her from victim to victor. Now get off our land before my husband's patience runs out, because I can see in his eyes that he's about 5 seconds from showing you exactly how frontier justice operates. And despite everything you've done to me, I would prefer not to have your blood staining the dirt in front of our home where our child will one day play. Harrison opens his mouth as though to deliver some final threat or insult. But something in Colt's expression, some promise of immediate and overwhelming violence barely restrained by the thinnest veneer of civilization, makes him think better of it. And he turns abruptly toward his horse, mounting with shaking hands while his hired men watch with expressions that suggest they're relieved. This confrontation ended without gunfire. "This isn't over," he calls back as he wheels his horse toward the gate. "I have resources you can't imagine, and I will make sure that everyone knows what kind of people you are. And I'll see this ranch foreclosed and both of you destitute before I'm done with you." Colt's response is delivered in a tone so casual it's almost conversational, as though he's discussing the weather rather than making a promise that everyone present understands he fully intends to keep. "If I see you or any of your hired men on my property again, if I hear that you've been spreading lies about my wife or interfering with my business, if you so much as breathe in our direction from wherever you scurry back to, I will hunt you down personally, and I will make you regret every choice you've made since the day you first laid eyes on Evangeline. And that's not a threat, Mr. Caldwell. That's a solemn promise from a man who keeps his word, so I suggest you ride fast and far and never look back. Because the next time we meet, I won't be nearly as civilized or restrained as I've been tonight." The riders disappear into the darkness, the sound of their hoofbeats gradually fading until silence settles over the ranch once more, broken only by the normal night sounds of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through the pine trees, and Evangeline feels her legs suddenly go weak as the adrenaline that has sustained her through the confrontation drains away all at once, leaving her trembling and lightheaded. Colt catches her before she can fall, his strong arms supporting her weight as easily as if she were a child, and he carries her back into the house where Consuela has already prepared hot tea and is fussing about pregnant women being subjected to such stress and men who bring violence to peaceful ranches in the middle of the night. And through her exhaustion and relief and residual fear, Evangeline feels something warm and fragile unfurling in her chest, something that feels dangerously like hope and perhaps even the first tentative shoots of love taking root in the ruins of her shattered heart. Later, after Consuela has retreated once more to her cottage with final instructions about rest and proper nutrition, after Colt has checked every window and door to ensure their security and positioned his rifle within easy reach, Evangeline finds herself sitting across from him once more at the dining room table, the same place where they'd been conducting their practical negotiation about marriage before Harrison's arrival interrupted them, and the question that had been hanging between them seems both more urgent and somehow already answered by the events of the evening. "You called me your wife in front of Harrison and his men. You claimed my child as yours before witnesses, so I suppose the question of whether we're going through with this arrangement has already been decided," she says softly, her amber eyes searching his face for some clue to his true feelings beneath the stoic exterior he maintains so carefully. Colt meets her gaze directly, and for the first time since she arrived on that stagecoach, she sees something vulnerable and uncertain in those blue eyes that have witnessed so much hardship and betrayal. And when he speaks, his voice carries a weight of emotion that he's clearly unaccustomed to expressing. "I meant every word I said to that bastard, meant it more than I've meant anything in years. And somewhere between watching you step off that stagecoach and watching you stand beside me tonight refusing to hide from your past, something shifted inside me that I wasn't expecting and didn't plan for and probably should be more frightened of than I am. Because I told you I wasn't capable of caring anymore. Told you this would be nothing but a business arrangement. But then I saw you standing there pregnant and terrified and still holding your head high with such dignity and courage, and I realized that maybe Margaret Sullivan running off was the best thing that ever happened to me because it meant I was free to receive the woman who was actually meant to be here. The woman who fits this rough life and this hard land and this damaged man better than any governor's daughter or banker's princess ever could. He reaches across the table and takes both her hands in his much larger ones, his calloused palms warm and steady against her trembling fingers. I can't promise that I'll be easy to live with or that I'll always say the right things or that I won't sometimes retreat into myself when things get difficult, because I'm a man who's been alone too long and forgotten how to share his thoughts and feelings. But I can promise that I will protect you and this child with everything I have, that I will work myself to exhaustion to give you both the life you deserve, and that I will try, genuinely try, to be the kind of husband and father that makes this family more than just a convenient arrangement. Evangeline feels tears streaming down her face, but for the first time in months they're tears of relief and joy rather than shame and despair. And she squeezes his hands with all her remaining strength as she gives him the answer that her heart has already known. Since the moment he draped his jacket around her shoulders in front of the whole judgmental town. I came here expecting nothing but a roof over my head and a name for my child, expecting to spend my life repaying a debt of gratitude to a stranger who showed me mercy when I deserved condemnation, but instead I've found a man worth building a real life with. Worth learning to trust again despite all the reasons not to trust anyone. And I promise you that I will be a true partner in every sense of that word. That I will learn your business and share your burdens and stand beside you through whatever challenges we face. And maybe, if we're both brave enough and patient enough, we might discover that this arrangement born of mutual desperation can transform into something neither of us expected, but both of us desperately need. A genuine marriage built on honesty and respect and the kind of love that grows slowly from shared experiences rather than arriving fully formed in a rush of romantic foolishness that burns hot and dies fast. 3 months later, on a warm summer evening when the Montana sky blazes with colors so vivid they seem almost impossible, deep purples and brilliant oranges and shades of pink that defy description, Evangeline goes into labor with contractions that start gently in the afternoon and build through the evening until they're powerful enough to make her cry out. Despite her determination to be stoic, Doc Patterson arrives from town in his rattling buggy, a crusty old man who's delivered half the babies in the territory and seen everything life and death can throw at a person. And after examining Evangeline, he announces that everything looks normal and natural, and that this baby is determined to be born before midnight, and he settles in with a cup of Consuela's strong coffee to wait for nature to take its inevitable course, while Colt paces the hallway outside the bedroom like a caged mountain lion, wearing a groove in the floorboards with his restless movement, and driving Consuela to distraction with his nervous energy. After 12 hours of labor that test Evangeline's endurance and courage to their absolute limits. After Doc Patterson's gruff encouragements and Consuela's soothing Spanish prayers and Colt's hand being crushed in Evangeline's grip during the final terrible minutes when the pain becomes so overwhelming. She's certain she cannot survive another moment. A healthy baby girl enters the world with a fierce, indignant cry that echoes through the ranch house and announces her arrival to anyone within half a mile of the property. And the sound is so perfect and so full of life and possibility that Evangeline finds herself laughing and crying simultaneously. while Doc Patterson performs his practiced routine of cleaning and swaddling the infant before placing her gently in her mother's exhausted but eager arms. When Colt is finally allowed into the room, stepping through the doorway with an expression of such naked anxiety and hope that it transforms his usually stern features into something almost boyish, he finds Evangeline propped up against pillows with her honey-colored hair damp with sweat and her face pale with exhaustion, but radiating a joy so profound it seems to illuminate the room better than all the lamps Consuela has lit. And cradled against her breast is a tiny bundle wrapped in soft white cotton, and when Evangeline smiles up at him with tears streaming down her face and asks in a voice hoarse from hours of screaming, "Would you like to hold your daughter?" The emphasis on the word "your" hits Colt with emotional force that nearly drives him to his knees. He approaches the bed with uncharacteristic hesitation. This man who faces down stampeding cattle and armed outlaws without flinching. Suddenly terrified of this tiny, fragile life that weighs no more than a sack of flour. And he takes the baby from Evangeline with hands that shake slightly despite their strength and steadiness in every other circumstance. And he stares down at the infant's scrunched face with an expression of such wonder and protectiveness and fierce love that Evangeline feels her already overflowing heart expand even further. The baby has honey-colored hair already visible on her, tiny head, impossibly soft and fine. And when her eyes flutter open for just a moment, they're the same amber color as her mother's. And Colt finds himself falling completely and irrevocably in love with this child who doesn't carry a single drop of his blood, but who is his daughter in every way that truly matters. "What should we name her?" Evangeline asks, watching the transformation taking place in her husband's face as he holds their daughter. Seeing the walls around his heart crumbling in real time as this tiny person accomplishes what months of careful courtship and painful honesty could not quite achieve. The complete breaking through of all his defenses and the full opening of his capacity to love without reservation or fear. Colt thinks of his own mother, a woman who died when he was 15 but who fought with every breath to give her sons a future despite the poverty and hardship that threatened to destroy them all, a woman whose love sustained him through the darkest times and whose memory has guided him through difficult decisions when he had no one else to turn to for wisdom. "Margaret Rose Bridger, after my mother, who was the strongest woman I ever knew until I met you," he says, his voice rough with emotions he can no longer contain or disguise. "If that name suits you and honors your family appropriately, though I'll understand if you'd rather choose something that connects her to your own heritage and history." "It's perfect, absolutely perfect, and it honors the woman who raised a son capable of this kind of love and generosity," Evangeline responds, reaching up to touch Colt's face with one gentle hand. Feeling the dampness of tears on his weathered cheeks and understanding that they've crossed some invisible threshold tonight, moving from an arrangement based on mutual need into something far more profound and lasting. As Colt holds little Margaret Rose, the baby's tiny fingers wrap around his much larger one with surprising strength, and something inside him that he thought was permanently broken after Margaret Sullivan's betrayal suddenly feels whole again. Healed not through the passage of time, but through the deliberate choice to love and be loved. Without holding anything back in protective reserve and looking up at Evangeline with their daughter cradled against his chest, he realizes that their mail-order marriage that began with such scandal and deception has transformed into something more real and true than any romance based on pretty lies and false promises could ever become. "Welcome home, Margaret Rose Bridger," he whispers to the infant who has already fallen back asleep with the complete trust that only newborns possess. "Welcome to a family that didn't start the way anyone expected, but that will love you more fiercely than you can possibly imagine, and you'll grow up knowing that you were chosen and wanted and cherished from your very first breath, and that sometimes the best families are the ones we build from broken pieces and desperate choices, and the courage to try again when every rational reason suggests we should give up. Outside the ranch house windows, the Montana sun finally surrenders to the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson and purple that seem to celebrate this birth and this transformation. And the broken spur ranch that began the day named for heartbreak and failure now holds within its walls a family that proves redemption is always possible for those brave enough to face their pasts honestly and build their futures on foundations of truth rather than convenient fictions. The town of Redemption Falls will talk for years about Colt Bridger's shocking reaction to his pregnant mail-order bride. Will tell and retell the story until it becomes legend. But those who know the family best, Consuela, who watches over them like a guardian angel, Sheriff Kane, who stands godfather at Margaret Rose's christening, even Reverend Cumberland, who had his doubts but witnessed the genuine love growing between two wounded souls. Understand that sometimes love doesn't arrive like lightning striking from a clear sky, but rather grows slowly and steadily like crops planted in good soil, tended with patience and care and watered with tears and laughter in equal measure until it becomes something strong enough to weather any storm. And sometimes, just sometimes, the most beautiful and lasting unions begin not with passion and romance, but with two desperate people choosing to trust each other with their broken pieces and discovering in the process of healing together that they've created something far more valuable than either could have built alone, a family forged not from blood alone but from choice and courage and the revolutionary act of loving without conditions or reservations. And that kind of love, built on honesty and tested by adversity, endures longer than any fairy tale romance because it's rooted in reality rather than fantasy, in sacrifice rather than sentiment, in the daily decision to show up and try and build something worthy of the trust that's been placed in imperfect hands. And as the stars emerge one by one over the Montana territory, bearing witness to this small family gathered in lamplight around a newborn who represents hope and possibility and second chances. The universe itself seems to whisper that redemption is always within reach for those willing to be brave enough to accept it.